All right, guys. Well, look, we'll kick off because I know a lot of people will be joining this afterwards, catching it afterwards. So, welcome to Aclass Kickstart Your Podcast. So hello to everyone here. Hello to anyone watching back on YouTube or wherever this might be afterwards. My name is Jennifer. I'm a senior content development manager here at Acast. So I spend my days trying to find and grow the best podcasts in Ireland and beyond. This evening, you're going to be hearing from some of the best people in the industry. We hope our advice and our expertise help you on your journey into podcasting. We want this to be as useful as possible for you, so please feel free to ask any questions you might have in the chat as we go along, as Simon says. So we may as well introduce you to the team. I just skipped over a slide there. Sorry, Simon. So you've got me. Hello. And then we've got Jacob. Jacob works in our partnerships team here at Acast. He is an expert in growing and promoting podcasts. So he's going to share some great tips, not just for kickstarting your podcast, but for making sure it's as successful as possible. Then we'll be hearing from Emily Owens, a commercial and podcast producer who has worked in the likes of Mario Rosenstock's Grub, as well as many podcasts, including Dr. Sabina Brennan's Superbrain. Emily will be taking you through some of the do's and don'ts of podcast production. Emily actually taught me a lot of what I know when it comes to audio editing, so you're going to be in very safe hands with her. And last but certainly not least, one of my favorite human beings, one of my favorite podcasts, author Caroline Foran is here with us, and she's going to tell us about her experience and maybe share some of her advice, anything she's learned through creating her own massively successful podcast, Owning It, the Anxiety Podcast. Everyone, hello. Hi. Hello.
Hi. What a nice intro. Oh my God. Thank
you. So guys, we're all, Jacob and Emily and Caroline, you're all going to be sharing really great tips on what you did right, what you did wrong. If anyone has any stories that they can add, maybe what they did right, maybe what they did wrong as we go through, feel free. But for now, we'll kick over to you, Jacob.
Amazing. Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Jacob. As Jen mentioned, I'm an associate partner manager here at Acast and work across our podcasts in the UK and Ireland. So I'm here to chat a little bit about getting into podcasting, give some best practices around setting up your show, telling the world about it, and also run through a few basic tips on things like artwork, descriptions, and trailers. But just kind of talking about how important it is to build a sturdy foundation for your podcast to enable yourself to grow it and achieve the success that you want in the future. So first off, before you even pick up a mic to start recording your first episodes, you've got to think about why you're making a podcast. So who are you in the context of your show? What is the story that you want to tell? And it might be that your role in the show is to tell other people's stories by acting as an interviewer, or you might be providing expert advice, entertainment, making people laugh. What's important is that you know what you want your show to be from the start. And that's not to say that it always has to be that way. Ideas evolve, they improve, and they change over time. And that's a really good thing too. So a great way of working on your idea is being clear with yourself and your prospective listeners about your show. And to do that, you can have a clear one-liner. So you can use this in your marketing, in your trailers, and as well as in your kind of initial discussions with people around, when you first tell them about your show. So this should just be a clear sentence that could hook someone into your show, explaining what it is, who's involved, and when it releases. And then finally, when you're kind of thinking about the content of your podcast, it's important to ask yourself, who are the listeners going to be? So This not only helps inform the content, the episodes of your show, but it's also really important for the marketing of the podcast. So you're thinking about things like, what age group are you aiming the show at? Is it for men or women? And, as I say, this will help you with the ideas of the content, but also focus the promotion of the show. So moving on, once you've got the idea of your podcast, the next kind of step is to create some great artwork. Now, artwork is so important to the success of a show. It's the first thing that anybody will see. And it can often, be the difference between somebody clicking on the show and engaging with the show, or just scrolling past it. There's a selection of really great artwork on the screen here. So what you might notice is that all of these have, the title of the show, the names of the hosts or the talent attached. And it might seem obvious that the cover art has to have large text, large images, but it's just so important to be clear. Now, this is because most people are going to be viewing this on a phone, so the cover art itself is going to be tiny, so don't overcomplicate it. You've also got to be mindful of how this will be viewed on devices, but different devices as well. So do the colors stand out even if the device is in dark mode, for example? How does it look next to 20 other podcasts? Does it stand out? Does it, kind of hide itself? And all of these things will help you to create this brand for your show and your successful cover art image. So next up, we're now talking basically about perfecting your show and episode descriptions to optimize SEO. Now, this might not sound like the most exciting part of your podcasting journey, but like with all of these best practices, it can make a real difference. So SEO, which is search engine optimization, refers to basically people having to search the web for your podcast, but also search podcast apps. So the goal here is just to make sure that people can find your podcast really easily if they're searching, for things related to the show, or they're searching for, your show specifically. But, they may also search for guest names or topics you might have covered. And this is why the show description and the episode descriptions are so important. So firstly, with the show description, you want to start it back with that one-liner that I was talking about. What's your show about? Who's hosting the show? When does it release? And then after you've got this kind of, most important info in, then you can get a bit more detailed. So you can give an insight into what to expect from the series. If you have any kind of reviews from listeners, quotes from the press, you can include these towards the end to kind of demonstrate the quality of your show. But again, it's just important to keep it fairly short and concise. It's likely someone's going to be reading this, deciding whether or not they're going to listen to the show. So if they get bored by the description, it's going to turn them away. So short and simple is better. And then secondly, on episode descriptions. So the key here is to keep these episode descriptions as specific as possible to that episode. So don't waste space in this area by reusing general information about the show. Describe that episode, include the guest name, any topics, and why people should listen to that episode in particular. And then finally, just to make sure that you use some keywords effectively. So as I mentioned, this could include guest names, topics that you're covering, genre related keywords, and anything that you think might help make your content more discoverable, something that you might think someone would search for and it's related. Make sure you include those as keywords. But it's important to note, only include those really relevant ones, because otherwise it's kind of spreading too thin. So next up, we've got trailers, and like the cover art and the descriptions, the trailer is going to be one of the first things that a listener decides to click on. And so you need to make that time count. Again, it comes back to this one-liner of your podcast. You want, at the start of the trailer, you want to introduce the show, introduce yourself, and try and give a kind of catchy intro hook to the show. You want to kind of give the listener an idea of what's to come as well. So you could, if you've got all the episodes recorded at this point, you could edit in some clips, some best bits from the upcoming series. That always works really nicely. And then at the end of the trailer, you want to make sure that you've got a really clear call to action. So for example, you can say rate, review, and follow on Apple Podcasts, Acast, wherever you get your podcasts, and include your launch date. So you're just inviting the listener to get involved. And then finally, it's a really great idea to create trailers of varying lengths, so that they can be used for different purposes. So you'll have a kind of 1 to 3 minute trailer that you can upload to podcast platforms. But it's also great to have a 15-second version, because this might work really well on an Instagram story, for example. But then also a 30-second version, because this could be good for other social activity or trailer swaps with other podcasters. And if you create all of this at the beginning, along with your main trailer, you'll kind of have all these different options ready for these kind of different marketing scenarios. So now looking at the kind of releasing of your podcast, the one thing that I really want you to take away from this section is that podcast listening is habitual. So the goal of your podcast should be to create habits in your listeners. And that starts by planning your release schedule, really well in advance, knowing how many episodes you're going to release in a season and when you're going to release them. If you suddenly end up with extra episodes, you can release them as bonus episodes. That's great. But it's important to not miss those kind of core uploads that you're committing to. So secondly, you've got to kind of work out whether your podcast is better suited to being released on an ongoing basis or seasonally. Now, a lot of the times the content will decide this. So, for example, if you've got a documentary style show, this kind of suits a seasonal release. It's kind of a closed story. But if it's more of a kind of pop culture, entertainment, or gossip kind of show, this kind of suits an ongoing release. Now, if you're planning to release seasonally, we'd recommend kind of 8 to 12 episodes in a season, and then no more than like a 6-week break in between seasons. So this again relates back to kind of creating this habit, making sure that you don't leave it too long between seasons and people forget about the show, but also giving yourself enough time to plan for a big relaunch, get those new episodes recorded, and go again with the new season. And then finally on this section, it's important to pick a day of the week and pick a time and stick to it. We'd recommend a weekday, any weekday, but you should kind of aim to schedule the episode to publish early in the morning, so about 3 a.m. And the reason for this is that some of the platforms take a little while to update, and you want to make sure that your episode is available in the listeners library, no matter how early they wake up. So the important bit about this is that once you've chosen your day, stick to it, make a thing on social media. You want people to be waiting on that day for the episode to come out. Next up, to talk kind of briefly about marketing your podcast. So talking about some of the best ways, but the best angles to promote your show. Now, marketing in moments is a really good way to kind of focus your promotional efforts, but also focus your resources, and kind of thinking about what moments are going to get the most pickup, what moments are going to appeal to new listeners the most. So the first one here is pretty obvious. This is a new show or a new season. And like I say, this is kind of the most obvious opportunity to shout about your show. The messaging here should center around what the show is, what listeners can expect from the series. The assets and the visuals that you're using in the marketing should be kind of fairly generic, in keeping with the brand that you've created with your cover art. And podcast platforms often support new releases, and they often have new season kind of sections to their home pages as well. So that's a really good way of kind of tying into what they're looking for. And it's also a good time to try and, drum up any press support that you can get as well. So the second bit here is for great guests. So if you do have guests on your show, this is a really great opportunity to tie in some promotion. And this angle is all about the guest, and it's about the story that they're bringing to your podcast. So it's no longer, general messaging around your show. It's about what the guest is bringing to it. So you can kind of think about, is the guest a household name? If they are, they're immediately going to draw in some listeners. They've got an existing fan base there. Or on the other hand, is it someone that's kind of rarely heard on podcasts? They're kind of bringing something new to podcasting. And, this is a kind of really interesting opportunity too. One of the most important tools for guest promotion is to utilize their channels, because this is where, you've got direct access to potential new listeners. So what I'd say is when you're interviewing them, try and get them to confirm that they're going to share the podcast on their socials. You can make it really easy for them. You can write them you can pre-write a tweet for them, send them the assets, the links that you want them to use, so that it's super easy and they can just go out and share it. Finally here, special episodes. So this can kind of take lots of different forms. It could be a bonus episode at the end of the series. Maybe you're adding something to your normal format, or it might be that you're kind of doing a specific deep dive into a trending topic. And, talking about trending, this promotion really lends itself to being picked up by social media. So the next slide. So speaking of social media, this is the kind of last section of these quickfire tips. And it's just to make sure that you're utilizing your channels, the specific channels that you might have created for the podcast, and, also any of the guests and connected talent to the show. So the point here is that social media is really important for audience retention, and to keep listeners engaged with your show. So as it says on the slide, the ultimate goal is to build a community that kind of feeds back into the content of the podcast. So you want to be engaging with your audience on social media, run, Q&As, or create special bonus episodes that are solely focused on answering listeners' questions, reply to their tweets, have conversations with them, and, really build this community around the show. It's also really important to focus on where your audience are. So obviously, different demographics are going to use different social media platforms, and you want to make sure you're, really tailoring your promotion to suit this. But also different types of promotion works better on different platforms. So Instagram's great for, audiograms, sharing clips of the podcast on stories, and then Twitter's better for this more engaged kind of activity, like the Q&As, like getting listeners to kind of give reviews of your show. YouTube's there as well. This can be used for kind of shorter form video content, some kind of behind the scenes video access, but only if you think there's kind of a good following there for you. So just make sure that the promotion is bespoke to the platform that you're using. And finally, on social media, the social media promo that you can do is so much more than just a post, per week to say that there's a new episode out. But that kind of activity is still so important. So still do it, still tell your listeners to follow, rate and review, and just try and find the balance between, finding new listeners, but also engaging and building your current audience, and creating the content with them. So that was a really quick overview, some quick tips on starting the podcast. And I'm now going to hand back to Jen.
Thank you, Jacob. I learned more than I would like to admit in that. That was really great. Thank you. All right. The only real thing you need to know about our next speaker is that in 2011, I emailed her asking for work experience, and she still hasn't replied. No,
I'm never going to live that one down.
No, that's not what you need to know. Emily Owens is an incredible audio producer who has so much experience, and she is going to share some good tips and tricks. Emily,
Blushing here,
I won't
blushing
mention
here.
it again, I promise.
I'm blushing here. I'm going to just start through a few bits here. So I'm sure everyone here has listened to many different kind of podcasts. They really cover all topics and themes. Podcasts are part of our everyday life. They're intimate. It's like having a friend in your ear. So when you're planning your own podcast, you want to be that friend in someone else's ear. So it's just like Jacob said, like have in mind who you're aiming it at. Are you aiming it at a particular group of people? What kind of genre will you be concentrating on? Is it like history or wellness or comedy? Will you be talking on your own, or will you have guests? Will it be a formal podcast or more of a conversational style? Are you planning on it being a weekly podcast or a series of podcasts? And what length is your podcast going to be? Having a plan and an outline in your head will get focused and will help you with picking your podcast name and your image and with the next steps of creating your podcast. There's lots of choices when you're starting out. You can do this really cheaply. You can spend a little bit of money, or you can really spend a lot of money. But don't feel the need to have to buy a lot of stuff to feel like a real podcaster. If you're just experimenting or starting off, start with the easy route. Like, look at where you're going to record, which is probably the most important part of podcasting. People record in loads of different spaces. People record in coffee shops, museums, but a home is a good place to start. What you're looking for is a quiet space with lots of soft furnishings. So places like your bathroom won't work as well. It's got bright and hard surfaces and they reflect sound, and your voice will bounce off the walls, making you sound really echoey, which doesn't sound great, and it is very hard to listen to. So recording in a place like your bedroom or a small bedroom with a duvet, and I am not joking, a duvet or a blanket over your head is a really good option that softens the sound and makes it sound like you're in a studio. Other places that work well are wardrobes or that closet under the stairs, because the clothes and the coat will deflect the sound. Cars, I keep laughing at this one because a podcast I do, she records in the boot of her car every week. So cars are a good place. Just surround yourself and your mic with lots of cushions.
How does she fit in the boot?
Oh yeah, she's got a 7-seater and she'll fit in the boot.
Okay.
Normally, yeah, it's worth a look. She's got her pictures up and all. It's hilarious.
And also on the duvet one, there's there's an ad running in on Acast in Ireland at the moment with my voice on it, and if you spot it, let me know, because that was recorded in the bottom of my wardrobe in my old house.
I've heard it.
My head. But yeah.
That's
Do you know this now?
And that's the thing. Some of the most famous voiceovers are literally sitting in bedrooms with duvets over their head. I am not joking. Just remember, so you're looking for a warm, soft sound. The larger and more reflective your room, the more echoey it's going to sound. So what are you going to record onto? So for a very basic recording, or if you want to just do some practicing, you probably already have all the equipment you need: a phone, the headphones that came with your phone, and an internet connection. Most phones these days have things like voice notes, so it's very simple to record a very simple podcast. There are some downsides to that. Now, it won't be the best quality and it will be hard to edit on your phone, but it's a good starting point. And you can do a bit of reading up on the best way to host your podcast, making sure you upload your podcast routinely, as Jacob said, and read up on RSS feeds so you know where your target audience knows where to find your podcasts. Also, you can create transcripts of your audio at places like rev.com in case you want to add that to your podcast. If you are planning to put a little time into your podcast, I do think you should spend a little bit of money getting yourself up and running. Again, it doesn't have to cost a fortune. There's lots of options. You can buy a good USB mic, which would be perfect for podcasting from as little as 40. Jen's going to show her lovely Rode mic, which I'm very jealous of, with its mount, which I'll talk about in a minute. They're really good. If you are planning some face-to-face interviews, which we'll hopefully be able to do really soon, then a recording Zoom, like a little recording player, something like this. I don't know where people can see me, but you can see my little Zoom. It's a really handy little system. As you can see, it's got the 2 mics up here on top, so one for you and one for your guests. And it doubles up as a USB mic as well. So it's a kind of really handy little thing to have. This one costs about 100 quid. I think you can get them bigger and fancier. This really kind of does everything you need. Also, I have very simple headphones that I use the whole time because I think they're very comfortable. These ones are as literally as cheap as €26. Handy number to have.
I learned a tough lesson on those Zooms when I was in college, that if you hold on to them Yeah, I think you're going to get to this. If you hold
I
on
am.
with your hand, because they're made of plastic, you end up with a little bit of interference. So how would you avoid that?
I'd mount mine. Always mount your mic. Like you're there. Your mic is mounted, and that is it. Like Jennifer said, you won't get the vibration or that mic handling noise on your recording, because it is very hard or fairly impossible to get rid of unless you have great technology to do it. So it is a good investment to get something to mount your mic on. And like these Zooms stand up, so it's kind of handy. You don't have to spend a fortune. They do stand up on their own, but just make sure you have something that's not going to fall over. Buying a small audio interface or a small little mixing desk are a very good investment too. And they're very cheap. You'd be surprised. Thomann is great for all things you need for audio recording. Also a bit of advice, I've been told this earlier. If you are recording with another person, do try and have a mic for each person you're recording. It just, Jennifer's laughing there, but it does just sound, it makes it for a better listening for your audience.
A lot of times we get asked questions about what's, I spent hundreds of pounds on a mic or hundreds of euro on a mic, and it doesn't sound that good. What's wrong with it? A lot of the time, when we always start with, can you send us a photo of you recording? And a lot of times we get a photo of them in an interview. There's 4 people around a table and there's one microphone sat in the middle of the table. I'm like, there we go.
And they're probably like right spread out, so they're not even near the bloody thing to record in the first place. A few important notes when you're recording: make sure you keep an eye on your mic levels. Make sure your voice doesn't go into the red above -1 dB. You'll get distortion and you'll get clipping, which sounds terrible, and there's nothing you can do to fix a bad distortion. That's just it. Also watch out for unwanted sounds like pen clicking. It's really nice. Jewelries, really annoying, and desk tapping, which I find really annoying in the back of your recording. There's nothing you can do to take these out, so try and avoid them to begin with. And one of the most important things when it comes to recording, make sure you're recording. Check it and double check it. It has happened, believe me. So now we're going to cover that. We're going to look at how. And how for me is where you're going to record to and how you're going to edit what you have. I love a little edit. That's what I do. And there's loads of different audio editing software systems available, which are all really user-friendly. If you have an Apple MacBook already, you have GarageBand. It's free. It's there. It's a really handy one. Another free audio editor is Audacity. It's an open source editor, which means it's constantly updating and it constantly has new features and it has everything you need to record and edit. It's a really good little system. If you want to spend a little bit of money, you can buy things such as Adobe Audition, Pro Tools, which is what I do use daily, and Ableton. They all do the same thing. So it's just a matter of finding something that you're comfortable using. It's down to personal choice when you decide to edit your podcast. Personally, Caroline might agree, I think it's a lot of pressure on someone to talk for 20 minutes in a row without losing your train of thought, or you're repeating yourself or making mistakes. These mistakes can easily be taken out in your edit. And if you're worried about the quality of where you recorded, there's plugins like EQ and compressors and limiters that will even out your sound quality. All you need to do is just play around with your audio till it gets the sound that you like. And always have your listener in mind when you're editing. As Irish people, we always say, having normal conversations, there's always people who breathe and say, oh, or but, or I don't know how many times I've had to edit, out of things. That's what Irish people seem to love to say, Don't be too quick to edit these out though. It's supposed to sound like real life. It's not supposed to sound like a Dalek or a robotic. It's supposed to sound like a normal conversation. That brings me on to my favorite part, is saving your work. Oh my God, back about 20 years ago when I was working in a radio station, when Pro Tools was super new, I was working on this project and I'd spent at least 3 hours on it. I had spent nearly half the day, I'd say, on it. I was very nearly finished and that wheel of death comes up, that bloody wheel of death comes up. And my computer just died. Everything, I lost everything. There was no Pro Tools backups back then. So of course I hadn't thought of saving it anywhere else. Everything was gone. So since then, I'm paranoid. I've seen it so many times. There's been so many important interviews down the years that have just gotten deleted so simply. It's crazy.
So
even an intern.
Sorry,
to
add to that, give it time to save, because one of my career lows was having like similar to the thing you had there, a Zoom. It was a Marantz I had, and following two very well-known radio presenters around for about 3 hours, and then I went, oh, this needs new batteries. So I went, stop, and immediately took out, and I didn't give it any time, and I lost everything. I lost absolutely every bit. And the only way, and I'd spent the whole night up that night, the only way I was able to make a feature out of it was because there was somebody who worked in the social media team there with their phone who had videoed some of it.
Oh my God, you guys are giving me so much anxiety at the moment.
Save it and give it time to save.
I think the most common text you've gotten from me, Jen, is I'm after accidentally deleting a whole recording. How can I recover it? And you're like, I'm in the middle of my very busy day. So yeah, it still happens.
Yeah, we hear. I used to work for a radio station, and I managed to delete all the audio off the computers. There was no songs, there was no imaging. Everything was gone. Some intern just managed to click it, all deleted off the system. Oh my God. So have multiples of files. There's so many places to back up to these days, like iCloud or OneDrive or Dropbox. I also had to say, and I'm sure Jen's heard me saying it 1,000,001 times, it's better to be looking at your audio than looking for your audio. Always, that's my rule of thumb. Plus, if you edit your interview and decide a few weeks later that you don't like it or you want to change it, if you have it backed up, you have your original audio and you can go back to it. So, Caroline, I'm sure knows about this. Recording in lockdown is a bit of a pain in the bum. It is a lot harder to record face-to-face interviews with people.
You get to wear your PJs though.
But there are a lot of solutions to that. You can record remotely with systems such as Zoom, which is different than the Zoom recorder. It's Zoom that everyone I'm sure knows. There's also other systems called Zencaster and Squadcast. And these all have the advantage of having a video option so you can see your interview as well. I find there's more advantages of recording remotely these days. As Caroline said, you can wear your pajamas. I find people are more relaxed in their home settings. They're not having to travel somewhere, and it makes for more relaxed chat. And I also find my husband has found he does he writes for music magazines, and there's been so many more people available to him since lockdown, because more people are available and want to chat and have more free times in their hands to chat. My next thing is the theme tune. You have to have a theme tune, and this is called branding. Every podcast should have their own kind of music, which establishes who they are and what their podcast is about, so they stand out from everyone else. There's a load of royalty-free music available online that you can use. Or even I know Sabina Brennan for Superbrain, her son plays the saxophone, so that's her theme music. So you can create something yourself. And if, like Jacob said, you end up doing some little trailers, make sure you use your theme tune on those, because it's a great marketing tool for your podcast. So the last bit for me now is just a few tips on recording a great interview. I'm sure Caroline might pull me up on some of these, but this is from my perspective.
I'm gonna pull you up. Yeah.
So for me, it's start recording straight away. There's always that chat or introductions before the interview starts, and your interviewee might have some little nugget of information or a great story that you weren't expecting. So start recording early. And also you feel like a more natural conversation where you're not having to stop the person and go, hang on, I'm going to start recording now. So then your chat naturally kind of segues into the interview. Plus there's the added fear that you'll forget to record once the conversation starts. So record early. 2, put your interviewee at ease. Check to make sure that there's no subjects that they don't want to talk about, and let them know that you're not trying to catch them out on something. You're there to have a chat. 3, do your research. Know your guests before you start interviewing them. A good interviewer will probably already know the answers to the questions they're going to ask, so phrase them properly to get the answers you really want. 4, have in mind the length of the podcast episode you want to create. So for example, if you're looking to record or to create a 30-minute interview piece, don't just record 30 minutes. Record more like 60 minutes. Give yourself that leeway to take bits out in the edit afterwards. Like the other day, I was recording an interview, or I was editing an interview, and I had over 2 hours of audio to work on. But when I started to remove the fluff and the little bits and pieces, it was about 50 minutes of a solid interview. So that was perfect time for what I was looking for. And remember, podcast listenership can take time to grow. So keep going and enjoy what you're doing. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Emily. Now, to put all of that into practice, let's talk to somebody who has a very successful podcast. Caroline, I don't think you'll mind me saying that when you first launched your podcast, the audio side wasn't your favorite thing in the world.
Yeah, and still is the same situation. Can I just say, I have such severe imposter syndrome being a part of this panel. Like oh my God. But anyway, let's talk about how I ended up with a semi-successful podcast.
Very successful podcast. How did you adapt though? Because you wanted to adapt, you wanted to bring your best-selling book into podcast form, and you didn't have much audio experience. So how did you adapt to that?
Well, so I thought that given the nature of my book that had done quite well is anxiety, and people who are suffering with anxiety are probably pretty overwhelmed. Sometimes, diving into a big tome of a book might be just adding to your overwhelm. So I thought the nature of the content would lend itself to someone going for a stroll, doing their whatever they're trying to do to just get a bit zen, and having me in their ears just to kind of help calm them down or help them normalize things. So I felt like it was a no-brainer in terms of the content, and moving from book to podcast. I actually had done, even though this is embarrassing because I had done my degree in college was communications and I specialized in radio production, but I was obviously asleep for the whole course because I don't know, maybe it's my own anxiety, but I approached the podcast on the assumption that this is too hard, this is too intimidating, I won't be able to do it. So what I would say to people to begin with is, if I can do it, you can do it from a tech perspective. And I just sort of said, okay, look, my husband, he's an engineer, and he always says, there is no such thing as a stupid question. If you Google any question, you'll find an answer. So Google was there as my friend to figure out things. Eventually, Jen became that person, which was amazing. And it was just a case of saying, okay, I'm going to take the pressure off myself. I'm going to buy a little microphone. So I started off with a Zoom recorder, and I actually bought a pretty fancy one. I didn't need to. I mean, I didn't even know you could use your phone. That would have been a safer bet to start with. And I just said, I'm going to sit in my room. I had a sock over the microphone because I didn't have a muff kind of thing to diffuse the sound. And I said, I'm just going to chat. I'm just going to see what comes out of this, and I'm going to just listen back to it. And I must have recorded about 5 attempted episodes before I got one that I thought, okay, this is something I could put out into the world. And then I was using Audacity, and I still use Audacity on my Mac. There's nothing fancy going on at all. Like I'm ashamed at the level of oh God, like I need to up my game. And I just put it out there. And I suppose the nature of the content I knew was needed, and I thought maybe I struck a chord with the time that I launched it, and people, there wasn't really much like it out there. And yeah, I gave it a go, and people really responded to it, because I guess I was putting a lot of myself into the podcast, which I guess it depends on the podcast you're doing, but that helps. Is to, obviously you can't have a completely original, well, you might, but it's hard to have a completely original idea. So what you can do to make it stand out from the crowd is bring yourself into it, and people will attach onto you, and they might like your voice, and they might like your approach on things. So that's really important. And then I just gave it a go, and I mean, I should have probably added to my skill set along the way, but I haven't. So there you go.
I think that's really important though. So really, for anyone here who wants to start, just give it a go is probably the most important thing you'll hear at all tonight. Yeah. Just give it a go, get a feel for it, find your voice. But what's your process for like coming at episodes and going, even if you think about how you're going to plan a series, how do you plan a series? How do you know what each episode is going to be, and what variation and what the content is? What's your process for that?
I would like to say I'm a lot more considerate of how a series will look before I do it. But at the moment, I'm at home with my tiny baby with limited help in lockdown. So I am a bit reactive and a bit last minute-y. But I suppose when I started out, I did have more of a sense of seasons, and I knew with my second season, I wanted to talk to more men, and I wanted just some kind of point of difference just to help differentiate from the seasons. And now I'm at the point where I'm just thinking, right, what haven't I explored yet? Who would be really interesting to chat to? And it's a case for me, it's a mixture of experts who maybe nobody knows them, but they're just brilliant at their topic. Or maybe it's someone who's really well known who can share their experience of anxiety. Or maybe it's someone who's not well known at all, but also has a very interesting story or is willing to share with me. So I'm kind of open to, because I have that one liner of knowing I want to help people normalize anxiety and I want people to feel on top of it, that opens me up to a world of different kind of interviews. And I also wanted to allow myself the buffer of having a few solo episodes, because as happens when you're doing a series, you know, interviews might fall through, you might delete one, which you shouldn't do, and then it helps to be able to rely on yourself to go and record a solo episode. So whenever you've heard a solo episode from me, it's probably because I've messed up something else. So it's a nice, but I find it's a nice balance. And yeah, I guess I would just think about, right, what do I want to look at? What do I think would be interesting? A lot of things now come to me, like people will email me saying this person is bringing out a book and might be interesting. Or like just last night, I was planning for my next season, and I was just on looking at TED Talks from anyone who's touched on the subject of anxiety, and seeing if I could reach out and like going on to their, I don't have a producer or anything, so I'm going on to their websites, I'm finding their, filling out their contact forms and saying, listen, I have this podcast, I'd love to chat to you about this. And not only would I say, this is my podcast, I would suggest a topic that we could come at. So for example, yesterday I got on to a guy who did a TED Talk, and like he probably gets 1 million emails a day. And his whole approach with anxiety was you can cure it in 7 minutes or something. And my whole approach is that's bollocks. Like it's about owning it and living with it. So I said to him, listen, we're coming from completely different perspectives. I think it would be a really interesting conversation if you're open to it, and I'd love to hear how you think it can be cured. And I know, Emily, you said obviously you want to reassure your guests that
in a case like that,
yeah,
go for it.
So this guy is obviously, like, he's a TED talker, he's a lecturer, he's able to have a bit of a discussion, and I don't feel so much pressure to just make him really happy by agreeing with everything he's saying, because I know he's looking for an interesting conversation.
He's looking for not an argument, but he's looking for a discussion, which is right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, when it's a celebrity who I'm totally intimidated by, I'm going to be like, yeah, that's all amazing. Yeah, everything you're saying is great. But you do get to the point where you feel confident enough to sort of ask questions that are maybe a little bit more challenging. I think the nature of podcasting allows you to go beyond the very basic questions that you might hear on radio when there's only 10 minutes to play with, and you can delve a little bit deeper, you can break down those barriers. So for me, like, it's still very much me enjoying having these conversations, and I think to myself, look, even if no one listens to this, I've gotten something from this. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoy the process of editing a podcast now that I sort of know what I'm doing. It's a very satisfying feeling to come away having done it. So I think first and foremost, you have to have it kind of scratching an itch for you, and it's satisfying you as a thing to do before you bring any sort of like monetary ambitions on into play.
You touched on it there, and I felt like there was something juicy that we didn't get. And it actually brings me on to a question I was going to ask. What has been your biggest challenge, aka what's been your biggest fuck up so far in the podcast? And that's important, not just to get the juice, by the way. Just
I've had plenty of fuck ups. And you know what? Because of the nature of my because it's about well-being and mental health, every time I cock up, I say, well, this is just more content. This is just something else to talk about because it gives you more anxiety. And there you go. You've gotten another episode out of your absolute shit show. So there's always that if you're going down the well-being direction. But I've recorded a podcast at Ryan Tubridy in person before lockdown quite a while ago, and we went for lunch to have it. I was so privileged, and then I realized I didn't fucking press record, and I wanted to just rip my own arms off. I was so annoyed at myself. That has happened. Other things where I'm not, like, just last week I had a podcast with someone where they were very, very hard to get. They had very limited windows of time, and their Wi-Fi was absolute crap, and I don't know how many times I asked them to like move around or try different things, and eventually I had to just continue having the conversation knowing I wouldn't be able to use it, and I just hoped maybe I could fix it. I couldn't. It was just very patchy, and then being willing to own up and say, look, I've made a mistake here, or not that I'd made a mistake, but I can't use this, it's not usable. And when you do have cock-ups, which will happen, yes, you beat yourself up about it, but for me, it helps just to kind of, I guess, to quote myself, own it and say, look, this has happened. It's not ideal, but you learn so much from making these mistakes. And now, like, whether it's recording, I backup record on so many different things. I use Quick, so for right now while we're in lockdown, I record on Zoom, I record on QuickTime Player, I record on my handheld Zoom. So I try to make sure that you know, every failure gives you I guess it allows you to sharpen your focus and learn something, which I know sounds kind of cliche, but it's really true. And you're going to cock up at some point, and it, you know, it's, you just have to accept it and then learn from it.
Yeah, it's human nature. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given when it comes to making your podcast? Or the best tip you've heard along the way?
Well, do you know what really helped, Jen? Like, I mean, all of my best advice has probably come from you, but
that's what I was aiming for. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Like, I felt that
going.
Committing to a day and time of the week, especially when you're starting out, it might seem a bit like, oh, I can just kind of drop in and drop out because maybe there's no brands on board, maybe it's just me. It really helps to set you up for getting to that point. So now I'm every Monday at 3 a.m. It goes that I stick to that 3 a.m. time, and it's mad. Sometimes I wake up, you know, at like 7 and I log on, and people have so many hundreds of listens already, people listening from all over. So committing to that helps give you a bit of accountability and structure, and makes you hit those marks each week or for your season. So from a practical point of view, that has been has really, I guess, elevated my sense of professionalism. The way it started out was kind of like a bit of a hobby, a bit of an experiment, and now it's very much a part of, it's probably one of the main verticals of what I do. So thank you for that, Jen. Other advice, just really, I think, try and see where you can bring yourself into it. I think that you know, you need that personality, unless it's really heavily information based. I think people, the message I get time and time again is that, you know, it feels like I'm listening to a friend, and oddly, people say my voice is calming, and I think I sound like a bag of cats. So if people are getting that from me, that's great. But yeah, just bringing the personal element to it, remembering that you're not on radio, you're in a podcast, you could take more risks, you can have longer conversations, you can veer off your plan, and always be willing to veer off your plan. I mean, like, I sometimes, depending on the guest, I will sometimes plan my questions, sometimes I don't, and I just think, look, we're just going to see where this goes, and I'm at that point now where I feel confident enough to let that happen. But I think it's really important, when, you know, to really listen to the person you're interviewing, and if they say something that resonates with you, it's going to resonate with your listeners, so delve a little bit deeper on that. And just be confident also to say things like, do you know what, I'm after losing my train of thought. That's a human thing, and people relate to that better. So you can always edit that out afterwards. But even for your guests, they're not going to think, God, who's this absolute idiot? You know, allow your humanness to be present, and you'll get a far more authentic conversation.
You touched on something there that you say it's not radio. And I think that's one thing we try to really say to people. It's not radio. Don't look at it like radio. Don't look at it like you're on a really tight time schedule. Radio is fantastic, and it will always have its place. But it is so different from podcasting when it comes to that. When I worked in radio, I always said the best piece of advice I got was the listener will never miss what they never heard. And when I was in radio and I was editing to get things, you know, 30-40 minute interviews down to the 7 minutes we had on, you know, because it was commercial radio, I thought that was the best piece of advice I'd ever been. Now that I've moved to podcast, I consider it one of the worst pieces of advice I've ever given, because you should allow them to hear whatever you think they will like to hear, whatever, you know, you think is important. And if you come at it from the perspective of they'll never miss what they haven't heard, well, then there's a lot they don't know that they're missing. And that's what I think is a really, really good thing about podcasting. But I was also going to ask you, you covered what your challenges have been. What has been your favorite memory of either any interview you've done or just the podcast itself so far?
God, there has been so many. I think it's just when, and it happens almost every day, when I get a message from someone who is maybe in Bangladesh or God knows where, saying, I'm after stumbling upon your podcast and I want to tell you how much a difference it's made for me. And honestly, because you're recording, you know, either with one person in front of you or one person over Zoom, you lose the sense of who's listening or what potential there is for people to be listening. And then when you get those messages, even if it's just one person who your work has resonated with, it is the most gratifying, satisfying feeling ever to have impacted someone. So those moments are it for me. In a more kind of ego way, I suppose it's been, you know, to see the work pay off. I started the podcast from zero. I had no listeners. I had, you know, there was no brands involved. I just said, I'm going to give this a go, to then get to the point where it becomes something that you know, brands are interested in. It made me really step back and think, wow, you've grown this organically from zero, and you didn't grow it with that intention. You just did something that you loved, and you thought, you know, I'm putting this out there because I know it's going to help people or it's going to engage people, and then the success has come as a byproduct of that. So that's been really nice. I think coming over to London and going into the Acast offices was really exciting for me, just to feel like this is not just me in my bedroom with a duvet over my head. You know, this is it's an industry that you've gotten involved in, probably at the perfect time, when it's starting to become so big. And yeah, God, so many. And then just the times when you're just having a conversation with someone and you just connect, and just that human connection for me is what it's all about. And then feeling like, okay, I've just had a 45-minute conversation with someone, and I feel like now that is someone I could then message again, and we're like this now. You know, it's not just a case of, oh, I've just shoved a microphone in your face for 5 minutes. It just, I don't know, it's, for me, it's the personal connection that gives me the biggest sense of, this is why I'm doing it.
So with all of those amazing things in mind, then, if you were to leave everyone here and anyone who's watching this back in the future with one piece of parting advice, what would it be? What do you think is the one thing anyone should know before starting a podcast?
I think the same way that I approach writing my books, and that is create what you think you would like to read or you would like to listen to. Trust your own gut. You are probably your own target demographic. If you think it's good, if you think it's funny, if you think it's interesting, chances are other people will too. And be patient with this. Just give it time, and the best things are worth chipping away at. It doesn't happen overnight, but when it does come, it's, you know, it's sustainable. So that would probably be it from me.
You can't get advice any better than that. Thank you so much, Caroline. That was so helpful. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions, aclass@acast.com is the email address. Send anything you might have at any stage in there to us, and we'll come back to you. And then on the next slide, here we go. We've got a Facebook group as well, so go and have a look at that. There's other people who have joined all the A classes there have been so far as well. If you want to get up and running, you can just use the code AClass. If you go to acast.com/hosting, you can get 3 months of paid membership using the code AClass, and you can find us on our socials as well. Thank you, everyone. Emily, Jacob, Caroline, it was so lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys. Such a pleasure.
Everyone.
Lovely.
Bye.
Bye.